Wonderful. Hi, good morning. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Lindsay.
Good morning.
Ah, we're arriving here in the middle of beautiful snow. Is it snowing there in Nelson right now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So much, yeah.
Yeah, it's so beautiful here, just like big snowflakes. And Lindsay and I are here to have a conversation about grief and ritual. And we're excited because we're offering, this is our second co-creation of doing working with grief in a ritual way and with ceremony and somatic practices and sound and weaving our magic together. And last year we put on a retreat, and this year we're doing a one-day offering at Tegum Hall in Nelson. And yeah, we feel inspired to come on and share and talk about grief and talk about ritual, and both to inspire you and to touch in on any parts of you that are curious about grief, deeply journeying with grief, learning how to have grief as a part of your life. And maybe even some of you who are interested in attending the grief ritual and want to know more and to tune into that with us together. So I don't know, Lindsay, if you want to begin and just say who you are and it's good. I always am like, yay, I'm so glad that we're connecting in this way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thanks for tuning in live, or if you're watching this recording. Yeah, my name is Lindsay, and I also go with the name Wild Grace Rising. And yeah, I'm going with the name Renaissance Woman, which was given to me once in a ceremony. It's hard for me to really encapsulate in a short manner who I am and what I offer. Yeah, some streams that are connected here is yeah, I'm a somatic therapist, transformational coach, and I work in transitional times as a doula with birth, and I'm also really passionate supporting and bringing consciousness and awareness and ritual to the cycles of loss and grief. And yeah, I'm so honored to be co-creating with you in this work, Courtney, and yeah, I'm so excited about who's come to join us and who's going to come and join us.
Me too. Yeah, and so for me, I have been deeply called to work with the place of grief and loss and death, actually, from right when I started to become a social worker in my early 20s. I worked in women's health with end of life, so early termination and end of pregnancy and stillbirth and these sorts of things, and then moved into the PICU working with families whose children were on life support and transitioning, and then did grief support afterwards. And then I worked at the Edmonton Bereavement Center for quite a few years. And I've always just been really drawn to this place and how I would describe it. I mean, first of all, it's in my gene keys that I would work with this layer of life, working with death and grief and endings. And I just have found there's so much meaning and beauty about what it is to be alive and what it is to show up in life in the spaces of grief and in the spaces of letting go and in the spaces of endings. And I always say, I feel like I learned so much about being alive and how I want to live my life through the work of walking with people through death. And I've been blessed in this life to get to be there at quite a few deaths and to feel that journey. And of course, grief isn't just about death, but I think death is sort of a really good sort of example of what grief is about. It's about that, like the ending, letting go, and the feeling there, the feelings that arise there. And yeah, and now what I'm embodied as is a somatic therapist and a ceremonialist. I work. I love working with ritual and ceremony and medicine, and I do a lot of relational healing work. I have a podcast with my partner, Mike Elliott, on conscious relationship and conscious parenting. And I love working with helping people repattern how they relate with self, with each other, with life, to come into more coherence. And, this offering of grief, it's like, for me, this feels like such a key piece, because I don't feel like we can relate with all these other pieces if we're not also in relationship with grief. Because how I see it is like, grief is such a key part of the cycles and the circles of life. And there are so many ways in our culture and our society where we are not even necessarily aware that what isn't being felt or what isn't being processed or what is being felt, that it's grief. I know that there's been lots of studies done on how often depression really is unprocessed grief, that just, it hasn't even been acknowledged as that. It hasn't even been seen as that. And just recently I saw a quote where they really talked about that so many of the things that are happening on the planet, so many of the hurts that are happening on the planet, are actually from unprocessed grief. And that for me is like, that like inspires me. And I know through my work of working with people in grief, I really saw that we can't really truly hold grief unless we have a really good container, like a place to bring it, unless we have practices and things we can lean into. We as humans need that in order to really touch the depths of what grief is. And I really saw that as a culture, there's like a re-remembering of how do we start to hold grief together? How do we start to make spaces together for grief? And then, when I discovered Frances Weller's work, because then I didn't do grief work for a while, it would show up in my practice, but I was like, oh, I need to find a better way, like a way that this can be held. And then when I read Frances Weller's book on the 5 gates of grief and just the ceremonial work, my heart was just like, this is it, this ritual work. And then it was just a like full body, like, I'm helping create that. This is important. I'm stepping up for this. And then I was really excited when Lindsay was also like, me too. I'm feeling it. This is a key part of my journey. And then here we are. Here we are.
Yeah.
So I wonder, Lindsay, maybe, I don't know if you want to speak a little bit to why grief has been important in your journey, or what's guided you into that space, or why you feel that this work is important.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm continuously reflecting on what draws me to this space, and because I've felt a resonance with grief my whole life, but I didn't quite have the words to speak it. And I don't think I'm unique in that. But I could feel it in my body. And one thing that's interesting I learned is that seasonally, when we're born, that there's an affinity for a certain part of the body and the emotions associated with that. And I was born in October, which is the time of the lungs, which is where grief is carried. And yes, holding that as a curiosity, if that's part of how I feel such a resonance with it. And yeah, I think I was always mystified and drawn to, and felt like there was something missing. And it really wasn't until I discovered ritual work more in an African stream, and like with Malidom Some's work, and where I realized like that there's that and through embodied experience of those rituals, I realized that how it was almost like it put together a piece of rather big piece puzzle piece of my human experience in place, and that like not just of like my experience, but my interconnectedness with everything and everyone. And yeah, and I'm still realizing that like it's almost like it feels like grief is inviting us into the remembrance, not just of grief, but of our deep need for community and ritual, and how that the medicine of that really unites us.
Mm-hmm. Oh,
that's an experience.
mm-hmm. Yeah, I just, and I know for me, in the grief ritual that we held last year, the retreat, like I knew this, right? I knew this, but the actual visceral experience of how ritual does that was so potent. And if just to describe it here to some of you, how I would describe it is for me, as I touch into those deep wells of grief, like just there's so much, right? There's so much. And sometimes I think we don't even realize how much, that there is so much of how much we're not touching into it because there's so much. And so here we created a space for it, we created a space, and we start to go into these places, and you start to realize, like, this is too big to just be in it on my own. Like, actually, like I could feel in my own system this, like, whoa. And then, but it's like, oh, but we're here together, and oh, we're doing this action, and oh, we're singing these songs, and oh, like I'm making eye contact, and oh, you're feeling it too. And suddenly there was this very visceral sense of like I'm touching into the ocean of grief, and almost it felt like we were like an anchor for each other, like a circle, an anchor that could like move through the ocean, but it's like we've got each other. And so then I felt like, oh, this is how you don't get lost. This is how you don't get lost in the ocean. This is how you stay in the ground and in the processing of it, is because you're doing it together. And and it brought to the parts of me that were still frightened and like still kind of like, oh, it's so frightening to think of losing a really close loved one, or oh, like it's so big to feel the grief about the forest, or what's happening in these different places in the world. There was something that happened in the feeling that with others, that it soothed me. Like I came into a soothed, peaceful place. Not that the grief's not there, not that there's not, but there was a layer of, that I didn't even realize, of shame and fear that was actually like around my heart, that that's actually what I was afraid to touch. It wasn't even necessarily the grief, it was that shame and that fear of it. And then in the process, I was like, oh no, the shame and fear is actually about being alone in it. Like it's not even a fear of grief. It's about being alone in it and not having ways. It's like, oh, and then it was like those parts could just be like, oh, I don't have to be so scared because my community's got me. There's other people here and they've got me. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, beautiful. As you were sharing, I was reminded of a quote. I'm actually not sure where it's from. That going back to me, it's the same ocean that the mystic swims in, and that the narcotic or drowns in. And I think that I see there's a connection here in there's a fear, is like I think there's a big cultural fear that like if we touch into that ocean Like, we might not know how to swim.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we might dissolve.
Yeah.
And I think that though there is some truth in that, in that we maybe dissolve into out of ourselves into wider community, which I see that in a way we're all deeply yearning for in these times, especially. And it's interesting that there seems to be like more and more and more and more and more to grieve. Yeah, and so
especially as we turn towards it too, like as we consciously start to turn towards it.
Yes, that more grief shows up.
Yeah, it's like, you know, like we would talk about this in constellations work. It's like the more you look, the more you see, and then the more you see, the more you realize is there, and then the more, you know, it's just like, whoa, you know. Which for me, I think that that's also why the beauty of ritual and the goodness and the nurture of it, like, is so important for us to not get lost. Is having the goodness and the beauty there as a reminder, you know, like when we have beautiful songs and music and flowers and
yeah, in the form of the rituals and how we're all holding it together, it gives, it allows for the magnitude of the energy of grief and then shame and fear to move.
Yeah, maybe we could even speak a little bit to the shame piece. I'd love to hear what you noticed last year, but I know I was aware of this. I'm just going to close this door here. I was aware of this, but again, it was like kind of neat to notice how it showed up, of realizing, oh, there's a visceral place in my body where even though I know logically that other people have these griefs and other people feel this, because I'd never been in a space where people were actually feeling it together, I realized there was actually all these layers of shame in my body of like, oh, I have to contain this, and oh, other people probably won't understand. And there's something so healing when you're sitting in this big circle of people and they're starting to share what's moving in them. And it's like, oh, that's moving in me too. And like, oh, that's moving in me too. And suddenly it was like, oh, this is not personal. You know, there's like personal aspects, but it's not personal. And you realize how little of the grief is actually personal. And then there's this like freeing from your shame, like from the shame that's there, because we're kind of, how I think of it in our society, because we don't have these spaces to normalize, to feel together, to be together in it, then we're all kind of like in our little thing, like, okay, like I'm gonna work with whatever this is here, but like alone, you know, in my cave. And then the way that lands is shame. Like, I have to go away. Like, I have to do this alone. I have to do this in isolation. And in that way, the shame actually keeps it stuck. It actually keeps it from touching the medicine that it's actually needing.
Yeah. And what's coming to me too, and I witnessed this in the retreat last year, is and in other places I see this as well, that we can question the validity of our grief and what we're holding, and because especially because there's so much to be grieving of what's happening on a larger scale collectively, that we can question the worthiness of that we're carrying or turn away from, or feel shame about even having grief about maybe something that seems more personal or like smaller and like smaller. And what I see in the grief work at a community level is how we all really need each other. We're all carrying unique pieces, and that the way that we're going to grieve is going to be very similar and connected, but it's also going to be very unique to each of us, of how it moves through us. and that we don't, like, there's no way that it needs to be. And yeah, and I feel like that's where there could be a lot of healing with shame, is like the allowance for, there could be a lot of freedom and energy freed up in that, in the allowance of what our authentic experience is.
Yeah, like the place we have in the circle, it makes me think of like the place, and then the medicine we bring to others just in our authentic expression and how we are with it. And yeah, I'd love to talk a little bit about the collective piece, because this is one of the things that we are going to dive into in our grief ritual day, is talking about the five great gates of grief, which, I always find it helpful to go into this a little bit, because it helps us touch on a bigger concept of grief, because often when we think of grief, we think of death or like specific endings. But I notice when we kind of speak to these different gates, people are like, oh, it helps them feel themselves in the wheel of grief, even if they're not in an acute grief or something like that. And so the five gates of grief, there's, everything we've loved, everything we love will lose. The places that haven't known love, what we expected but didn't get, the sorrows of the world, and ancestral grief. And, these are big pieces, but they're also something that all of us are being with in our own unique way, like Lindsay said. And what's really alive and big right now, right, is the grief about what's happening in Israel, the grief about what's happening in Palestine, the grief about what's happening in all kinds of places, and with the forests. And for many of us, it's like this grief that we're feeling, and it's a collective grief, but how do we be with that? How do we move it? And, this is where grief can end up spilling out as other things, like anger at our partner, disconnection, this like feeling isolated. It can look like turning towards, substances to help ourselves feel better. And some of it is the personal, but some of it is just literally, like, I often think there's literally these waves of grief that are just moving around the planet, that are in the collective field, that we're feeling. And, depending on who we are and how sensitive we are, we might be more attuned to it, and others not as much. But I really feel and know and watch and see and hear this in working with people, how much those waves are moving around the planet, and we're affected by them, And when we can intentionally come together and speak to it, and intentionally come together and feel it, it gives a way for the collective piece to heal. One of the things I often talk about in constellations work is one of the biggest losses is just not having the spaces to come to tend to the collective, And in our culture, we become so, well, I'll be with my grief and you be with your grief, but then there's nowhere to like collectively work on and tend the pieces that are collective, so that we can grow and learn, and so that our collective field can come more into love. For these really massive traumas on the planet to heal, many nervous systems and people need to be able to turn towards it, to feel it, to stay resourced in that, to digest it, and then that's how something new can happen.
Yeah, and joy can get access.
Yeah, joy and problem solving, creativity. Like we can't come more into that creative, let's work together to deal with this, what this is, if we're not able to come together to feel the reality of it and the grief about it, and to like resonate together. And so, because we have to, and I see this, I'm sure you do too, in couples work, and it's like, first you have to be willing to feel together what's not working, what's not feeling good, what's feeling heavy, what are we sad about. You have to first address that before you can move into these other layers. And Joanna Macy talks about this a lot, that so much of the crisis on the planet is literally just us not being able to turn or not wanting to turn towards feeling these places. But I would also say, and I know you'd agree, Lindsay, is that our nervous systems need each other to be able to turn towards it. Like a lot of these pieces are too big, to feel and turn towards if we're not in connection, if we're not in a bigger field of regulation, we're going to get overwhelmed. We're going to be like, oh, it's too big. But if we're in a whole community of people that are touching into it together, that opens up a way to stay regulated and calm while we feel it, connected to ourselves while we feel it. And so for me, when I think of like what my practice is to change the world, like this is where I'd say like my dharma is like, let's tend to the feels, let's tend to these places of emotion, let's come together and feel it and feel through the layers and like love it and learn about it.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, and yeah, there's big letting go into the unknown in that. And I think that is such the big medicine at these times is that we know we need each other. And I feel like the answers of moving forward in a good way are us coming together, but we don't always know what that's going to look like and what it's going to create. And so I also, I hold a great curiosity with this and see that I'm curious about, what can happen in our individual lives and how that ripples out from coming together and tending to these places in community.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't know, like I was writing a little bit just as we were approaching just making this offering. And one of the things I wrote was like, maybe one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen in my life is people grieving together, which, is sort of fascinating, but like also realizing how little in our world we maybe have seen that, where people are actually consciously being with grief together. And in a way, like what gets activated in us on a cellular level when we get to witness that and watch that and receive that and feel that, there's a huge download about what it is to be human. And I remember that feeling at the end of the retreat last year of like the part of me that felt sort of like victimized in life, like, why does there have to be like death, or why does there have to be these things, like just that part. And then feeling this big exhale of like zooming. It's like I could feel in the ritual itself this huge zooming out of like, this is the dance of life. And I could just feel this like, and this part of me that knows how to be the center in that. But how interesting, it's not until I could feel others learning that at the same time that it could land in this deep way. And Lindsay led a beautiful universal dance as a piece at the end that beautifully embodied that exact feeling. And what a powerful way to rest into life.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it was so phenomenal for me to leave our retreat and go immediately into a community celebration of life. And that, it was, in my experience, no one else, I felt like people weren't holding back. In my experience of funerals and celebrations of life in the past, I felt like there was always like a bit of a holding, and I could feel in this. It was one of the most beautiful ceremony rituals I've ever been to in my life, because I could really feel in the field that people were allowing themselves to be in joy and celebration, or to be like fully in their grief, and to move between them. and all together.
Mm.
And it really, I think I'm actually still integrating the power of that. And
Mhm.
yeah, and I could really feel in me in that experience and other experiences in life. There's just this deepening into trust of the web. Yeah.
I like that sentence, deepening into the trust of the web. Yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Which I notice when I hear those words, it's like there's this huge like my nervous system's like something's holding me in this great mystery. Like this great mystery. Like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, there's something here that's bigger that I can lean into.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah, and so I guess like I'm just feeling people out there, if you're wondering about joining, some of you might know, like be very clear what your grief is. And for some of you, it might be, I don't really know, like maybe you just have a lot of trauma, like maybe you're just in a difficult time in your life. Maybe there's just something, or maybe that none of that is true, but you feel called. I would encourage you to move towards, because how I would describe this work is that the experience itself will teach you, and you don't have to show up with any, like I was surprised for myself and others, because there were lots of people in the circle that I was working with in other ways, and I was surprised by what came up for them in the circle that I wouldn't have thought or what was going to emerge, and vice versa for me. So it very much is, when you show up in the circle, it's actually the act of showing up that's going to show you what the medicine is. It's going to show you what is ready to move in you. And all you need to do is just show up with a willingness and a curiosity. And so, and then we'll have lots of different ways that we can work with this. One of the things that I love working with Lindsay in this way is that we both have sort of this mystical, shamanistic way of working, and we have experience with the nervous system and therapy. So there's this we have a lot of awareness of how to really have a good rhythm to things and make sure that we integrate, and that there's going to be a lot of intention to having spaciousness for you to move between self and the communal. There's going to be a lot of intention around how do we lean into the field first and creating safety and coming into that safety, and then also how do we then integrate and come out of the ritual in a way that when we go home we can feel our feet on the earth, and we have some clarity of how we want to take this back into our home. Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder if anyone has any questions, or can you see if I can't see
That's
here.
the one thing. So for just to orient you all, we're using StreamYard to do this, and it's the first time I've invited someone on, and so we actually have 3 different platforms. So I have no idea at this point how we would see comments from all 3. Oh yeah, some destination. Yeah. So it feels like for me, this is the next thing I have to learn about. Lindsay and I've been talking about this as we learn about technology. That's like one step by one step. It looks like there's some settings I'd have to do to set up comments.
Okay.
Yeah. That's the next piece. I'm celebrating that we were able to do it this way and sort it out and be here together. Yeah. But also, maybe what we could offer is, if anyone does have questions, feel free to message Lindsay and I. And even what we could do, I mean, how I could do it on my end is, if you send me some questions, I can actually make some posts about it. Because my guess is, if you have a question, then other people have the same question. And so I'd love that. I'd love to feel inspired by the questions that are emerging for people.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Lindsay. Thanks for having this
Yeah.
conversation. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it. It's going to be beautiful.
Mm.
Yeah.
Me too.
Okay. Have a beautiful day.
Yeah, you too. Bye bye.
Bye.